Good afternoon. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Yevamos, daf Ayin Zayin, and we're starting about 8 lines or so, 7 lines from the bottom of Ayin Vav Amud Beis. We were in the middle of discussing whether or not we're able to say the drasha of Amoni v'lo Amonis and Moavi v'lo Moavis, which is really a part and parcel of the discussion of our Mishnah. So the Gemara says in line with that, 7 lines from the bottom, Elameata, if you can make such a drasha, why don't we say Mamzer v'lo Mamzeres? Why don't we distinguish between the genders of a mamzer to say that a mamzer is problematic, but a mamzeres is not problematic? Says the Gemara, we can't say that. Mamzer ksiv mum zar. It is a blemish from a stranger, and that applies to both genders and not just one. What about mitzri velo mitzris? Says the Gemara, shani hachad the mefarish time of the kra. There we have an explicit reason about when it comes to Ammon and Moab. We have an explicit verse in Tanakh that speaks to us about why it is that they are restricted to us. What does it say? Al asher lo kidmu eschem belechem uvamayim. The problem with Ammon and Moab was that they did not come out to greet us with bread and with water. And says the Gemara, darkol shal ish lekadem, that would be appropriate for a man to do so. V'lo darkol shal isha lekadem, and it wouldn't be appropriate for a woman to do so. So says the Gemara, that's why by Ammon and Moab we make a distinction between the men and women, but by Mitzri and Mitzris we don't make a distinction. Says the Gemara, that's not really so true. What would have been appropriate is that the men would have greeted the men and the women would have greeted the women. Doesn't mean that they have to stay hidden the whole time. The women should have come out as well. So why is it that we are only makbid on the men and not makbid on the women? Ishtik. So the Gemara says there's no response to that. Miyad, right at that point, the Gemara says, Vayomer hamelech sha'alata ben mizehelam. Who is this child? Why is it that we changed the language of child? Earlier it said Hasam Kari Le Nar. We had referred to David as a Nar, and here we call him an Elam. So says the Gemara, Hachi Ka'amar. He was saying there's a halacha that's been forgotten. Halacha nis alma mimcha. That's what the halacha of Ahelim is missing over here. Say usha'al bebeis hamedrash. Go ask and find out what's going on with Ammon and Moab. Why is it that the punishment wasn't for both genders, if in fact it should have been the case that men should have gone out to greet men and women should have gone out to greet women? So the Shiloh was brought to the base medrash and Amrulay, Ammoni v'lo Ammonis and Moavi v'lo Moavis. And that's what they said the din was. Actually, Doeg kol hani kushyasa. So Doeg was the one who was talking to Shaul at the time. He brought all of these questions and ishtiku, and they were very silent. They were silent about it. So they really weren't sure about the Ammoni and Ammonis and Moavi v'lo Moavis distinction. And if that's true, then what would that say about David ben Yishai, who is a descendant of Rus? So says the Gemara, they wanted to say that he had a bad Masorah, that he's a psul. Says the Gemara, miyad immediately v'amasa ben ish. We see that a pasuk was then brought up about a man, Amasa ben Ish, and who was the Ish? Ushmo Yisra HaYisraeli. But then on the next line, on the 4th line of Ayin Zayin Aleph, he's not only referred to Yisra HaYisraeli, he's also referred to as Yeser HaYishmaeli. Why is he referred to as both? Says the Gemara, because of this sugya. Amar Rava Melamed Chagar Charbo Ki Yishmael. He picked up a sword and he held it up, like Yishmael would do it. Anyone who doesn't agree to the distinction of Ammoni versus Moabis, that the men are not allowed, but the women are allowed, and Moavi v'lo Moabis, and the halacha is correct, and we make the distinction. We learn from Shmuel Hanavi, from his bezin, Ammoni v'lo Ammonis, Moavi v'lo Moabis. And even if your question isn't perfectly answered yet, we'll get discussed that a little bit more later as to why it is that the women were also, why they were excluded. The Ammon men and the Moab men, where they're not allowed to marry in, but their female counterparts, the women of those communities, are allowed to marry in. We couldn't answer the question logically, but still, this person stood there with a sword in his hand and said the halacha is like the Beis Din of Shmuel Haramati, that really Ammon and not Ammonis, and Moab and not Moabis. Says the Gemara, Mimehemen, after the fact, David's already been born. You're going to come here now in the 11th hour, past the 11th hour, you're going to tell me that David's fine. He's already been born. You're standing on a soapbox screaming that the halacha is X, Y, or Z. It's already done. It's done and over. Says the Gemara. And how is that even believable? You're standing there, Chargo That's crazy. Anyone who teaches a halacha, and then the scenario about that halacha comes about in sequence after you've already taught the halacha, then understood. In kodem ma'isa amra shomin. If you say the psak beforehand, great, we believe you. V'im lav. But if you say the psak after the fact, and in this case, David was already born, he was already a significant person. So in shomin. Says the Gemara, and typically speaking, that's true. We don't come in after the fact and give a psak, but rather, Shani Hachad Hashmuel Beis Dino Kaim. At this time, Shmuel was still alive. He was a Navi. Fine. Mikol Makom Kasha. The Gemara says you still haven't answered the question. Why is it that the women did not go out to greet their female counterparts? Why didn't the Moavis and Ammonis women come out to help the Jews? Says the Gemara, Hacha Tirgimu Kol Kavuda Bas Melech Pnima, because all of the honor of a Bas Melech is inward. So the way the Gemara is understanding this pasuk is that they shouldn't have left the house. What's appropriate under those circumstances is for a woman to stay in the house. So the Gemara says there's two possible reasons why the women did not go out to greet the Jews, the Ammonis and Moabis women. One is because of the pasuk of Kol Kuvud Bas Melech Pnima, and the other is the famed story with the Malachim and Abram, and they wanted him to know how Tanoah his wife was. So one of the Malachim said, "Where's your wife?" And then he responded, "V'hinei ba'oel," that she's in the tent. So one of these two reasons. So maybe that's Kitanoi. Maybe there's a machlokes Tanoim as to what the reason is as to why the Ammonis and Moabis women were allowed to marry into Klal Yisrael. And the Gemara says, "Ammoni v'lo Moabis, Ammoni v'lo Ammonis, Moabi v'lo Moabis." To Rabbi Yehuda, Reb Shimon Omer al Dvar asher lo kidmu eschem b'lechem b'mayim darko shel ish lakadim. So two different ways to understand, and either way, it is the case. It seems to be that our basic understanding of Ammoni v'lo Ammonis and Moavi v'lo Moavis is still true. And the reason why the women were allowed to marry in from Ammon and from Moab is because they didn't have to go out to greet the Jewish people when they were walking up, because it was lack of tznius or just because of the strength of the drasha of Ammoni and Moavis. Based on this, there are some beautiful drashas about how to understand David himself, because David was the child indirectly through Rus. So it says the Gemara, we say this pasuk all the time on Rosh Chodesh. We're going to say it again soon. So what does it mean that pitachta l'mosei rai, that you untied my vines? Says the Gemara, Amar David lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. David said before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono shel olam, shnei musaros shahayu alai and pitachtam. There were two ropes that were bound on me, and you opened them up. The two binds were Rus HaMoaviyah, V'Naam HaAmmonis. These are two people from the two nations that we're just discussing. Rus HaMoaviyah was the matriarch that led to David, and Naam HaAmmonis married not David and not even Shlomo, but Shlomo's son Rechavam. So David's grandson Rechavam married Naamah, who was Ammonis. And he wanted it to be that his lineage was pure. And because the halacha is that an Ammonis and a Moabis are allowed to marry in, Pitachta l'mosei rai, therefore everything is wonderful and beautiful. Next drasha, very similar. Dorashava, Mai dechsiv rabosa sisa ata Hashem Elokai, yivlosecha ma'ashosecha eleinu. You've done such wonderful things for us, and it's Elenu in the plural. Elai lo ne'emar ela Elenu. Melamed shahei Rechavam yoshe b'cheiko shel David. The grandson Rechavam was sitting with his grandfather David, and what does David say? Amar lo alai ve'alecha ne'em rishtem mikros halalu. These two psukim are speaking about me and you. These psukim that indicate that an Ammonis is allowed to marry in, because that was Rechavam's wife was an Ammonis, and David was a descendant of a Moabis. So that's what the Gemara is referring to. Two different approaches, but the same idea. And number 3, Darashava Maidachsivaz Amarti Hine Basi b'Megillah Sefer Kasuv Alai. Megillah Sefer, a reference to parts of the Torah that there are psukim that speak about this Pitachta l'mosei rai idea. Amar David Ani Amarti Ata Basi. I thought only now that I became to this very high stature in the Malchus that I'm such a chashuv person now. Lo yadati shem Megillah Sefer Kasuv Alai. I was pre-written about in Megillah's Sefer. How so? Hasam Ksiv Hanim Tzos. In regards to the story of Lot, it says Hanim Tzos. That's what the Gemara says. It's a pasuk. V'shtei benosecha Hanim Tzos. Your two daughters who are found by you, which was Ammon and Moab, Me'av. Right, that's what the pasuk says by Moab. And Hacha over here, Ksiv Matzasi David Avdi b'Shem and Koshi Meshachti, that David was now anointed. So he sees that he's been spoken about already in the psukim. Let's get into a halachic sugya about an Amonis. Amar Ula, we're 2/3 of the way down on Ayin Zayin Amar Aleph. Ula says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Bas Ger Amoni, the daughter of a person who converted from Ammon. So Ksher Lekahuna, even though that's really not supposed to be, because this man was an Ammoni and he's not supposed to convert it. The daughter is still acceptable for Kahuna. Amar Le Rabba Bar Ula Le'ula Kemat. But Rava Bar Ula, the son of Ula, said to his father, who is that like? If you want to say it's like the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, that can't be, because Ha'amar Bas Ger Zachar Ke Bas Chalal Zachar, that if the father is a ger, forget about being Ammon, Stam a ger, the person would be a Chalal. All the more so would be true over here, but because the person's an Ammoni. Vikar of Yossi Pshita, but according to Rav Yossi, for sure that this person, that this Ammon man who's a ger who had a child, that the daughter would be kosher lekehuna Pshita, because Ha'amar Af Ger Shanasig Yoras Bitok Sher lekehuna right away. Unlike the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, where he's very restrictive and says that first child of the first of those gerim themselves is going to be a halal. However, the next generation, just like the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda would say that it is not allowed, so that would be his Shita. But over here, Rabbi Yossi's Shita that it would be allowed. So then the Gemara says, V'chitema, and if you want to say that, what then is Rabbi Yochanan teaching us? Rabbi Yochanan is teaching us something, right? But it doesn't work for Rabbi Yehuda, and it's obvious according to Rabbi Yossi. So let's understand the difference between Rabbi Yochanan, who's trying to teach us a chiddush, and Rabbi Yossi, for whom this is nothing to be taught at all. It's so obvious. Maybe we're only talking about those who are rawi to be brought to the kahal. That's what Rabbi Yossi is teaching of al hay dein rawi lavo b'kahalo. But for an Ammoni, the Bas Ger Ammoni, who's really not appropriate to be brought into the Jewish people, maybe that's where the distinction was. Minale, where would he have learned that out? Maybe he would have learned this out from a Kohen Gadol Ba'almana. Says the Gemara, you can't learn it from there. You can't compare the case of the Bas Ger Ammoni to the case of the Kohen Gadol Ba'almana, because the Tashmish Amita that created the Bas Ger Ammoni was mutter. However, the Tashmish Amita between a Kohen Gadol and Almana is aser, so the cases are not comparable. Says the Gemara, second of the wide lines, okay, but a chalal yochiach, the case of a chalal will prove us wrong. Says the Gemara, you can't learn from there either. It's true that we may treat them both like a chalal, and Rabbi Yochanan's din says that a Bas Ger Ammoni is a chalal, but that doesn't matter because, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't say that, but that's what we're trying to understand here is Mala chalal sheken yitziraso be'avera. A chalal is created with an avera, but that's not true by Rabbi Yochanan's din. Says the Gemara, Kohen Gadol yochiach. This is what we call a circular logic. You ask me a question and I have an answer over here. You ask me a question, I have an answer over here, which leads to the question, which is circular. So because both of them really partially answer the question, therefore the Gemara says, V'chazar hadin, we're going to go back and forth on the halacha. Lo re'izeh ki re'izeh. This part of the logic is not like that one. Lo re'izeh ki re'izeh. And that part of the logic is not like this one, but we embrace both of them to teach us a din. So what din do we learn? That they are not like the rest of the women in Klal Yisrael, and their daughter is going to be psula. So maybe afkan, maybe we should say over here by the Bas Ger Ammoni she'eno berov kal ubito psula. Maybe we should say the same, that the halacha should be the same, and that is where we might have a chiddush from Rabbi Yochanan that we don't paskin that way, that we say that the Bas Ger Ammoni is absolutely fine. Says the Gemara, you can't say that because the tzad hashava that you just found from the cases of Kohen Gadol Ba'almana and Chalal, that's not right. Malatzad hashava shabahan shekain yesh bo tzad avera, yesh ben tzad avera. When you're talking about a Chalal, when you're talking about a Kohen Gadol Ba'almana, so there's a tzad avera there by the Tashmish Amita. That's not true by the Bas Ger Ammoni. She was not created by anything aser whatsoever. Says the Gemara, Dilma be'amoni shenasa bas Yisrael kamers. Maybe we misunderstood the case of Rabbi Yochanan. Maybe what we're talking about is a ger Ammoni, and he married a Bas Yisrael, and afal gav de biyaso be'avera. And even though they shouldn't have gotten married, because a person from Ammon is not allowed to marry a Jewish woman, says the Gemara, still bitok shera. Maybe that's the din that Rabbi Yochanan was trying to be mechadesh, and how he's different than Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara says in response to that, 2-3 lines from the bottom, you're absolutely right. You figured out what Rabbi Yochanan was talking about. We had initially thought that Rabbi Yochanan was talking about an Ammoni and an Ammonis who were gerim, who had a child. That's not what we were talking about. We're talking about a man from Ammon who should never have converted in because he's not allowed. He slept with a woman who is Jewish and they had a child. Would that child be kosher with a kahuna? Rabbi Yochanan says yes. And Rabbi Yossi wasn't dealing with that case. So the question falls away. And in fact, the Gemara verifies, Amar Le'in, Ravin, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael, Amar Rav Yochanan had said, Bas Geramoni, Ubas Mitzri Sheni, if you have the daughter of a man from Ammon who tried to convert, or the daughter of a man from Mitzrayim who tried to convert in the second generation, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kshera, he says the child is going to be kosher for kahuna. Reish Lakish Amar Psula, and he's going to say that the child will be puzzle. Let's go through the two options. Reish Lakish Amar Psula Diyalif Lami Kohen Gadol Be'almana. Reish Lakish says this is very similar at this point. It's similar to the case of the almana because the Tashma Shemita is aser, because the ger Ammoni is not allowed to sleep with the Israelis, just like an almana is not allowed to sleep with a kohen. So it's a kohen gadol. So it says the Gemara, but Rabbi Yochanan says Amar Kshera. He says these women are going to be ksheros. They're allowed to marry into the kahuna. Why are they allowed to marry into the kahuna? Top of Ayin Zayin Amid Beis, because the Tani Reb Zakkai Kamei de Rabbi Yochanan Kim Besula Me'amavi Kachisha. How do we understand this pasuk? Lahavi Giores Mikana Sheiksher Kahuna. When the pasuk says Ki'im Besula Me'amav Yikach Isha, we do learn one thing from this pasuk, that a Giores Mikana, a Giores who is born from her parents, Mikana means from her original house or from her nest. So we say that if she's born to her parents, Sheiksher Kahuna. The Amar Le Ani Shone Amav Me'amav. What is the drasha that he gives over here? That's what Reb Zakkai said in front of Reb Yochanan, and here's what the drasha is. When I look at the pasuk me'amav, ki'im besula me'amav, it's amav me'amav. There's an extra mem there. Lahavi besula haba mi beis amimin, to include a besula who is the result of two nations. Ve'at amris gioras mechana besulo. You're only saying it's just a regular gioras, but not other nations. That's not true. So says the Gemara, what are the two nations that we're talking about? Ilema Ammoni Shanasa Ammonis, if you want to say that an Ammoni married an Ammonis, Umay Mishne Amin, why does it say two nations? To teach us to Zachar Masurim and Akevos Mutaros, like the din is that Ammoni v'lo Moav is that the boys are allowed and the girls are not. Hainu Giors Mikana. Then the same din should have been applied by two parents of regular gerim. Ella must be be'amoni shenasa ba'as Yisrael, and that is how Rabbi Yochanan. That was our re-understanding of Rabbi Yochanan, to not have the kasha of Rabbi Yossi on him, that it would have been pashut, as we saw in the bottom of Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph. So therefore, we understand that Rabbi Yochanan was talking about an amoni shenasa ba'as Yisrael, and the din is that even though they're usher to sleep with one another, if in fact they have a child, the child would be kosher for kahuna. Says the Gemara a quarter of the way down, some say that this brisa that was quoted about the pasuk of Ki'im v'sula me'amav yikach isha actually was quoted a little differently. The conclusions will be the same, but just a different approach to the brisa. And the Gemara says as follows: V'ika de Amre, Amar lo ani shone amav me'amav. That when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to Rabbi Yochanan, that when he looks at the pasuk Ki'im b'sula me'amav yikach isha, that the word amav me'amav, the mem is extra. Lahavi b'sula haba mishne amamin. Extra language that we didn't have in the first one, that the letter mem in me'amav teaches us to include a child who's born from two nations, and from a nation that has two nations. You're going to say it only applies to regular Geirus parents and not these special nations. That's not true. And the Gemara now questions this second version, this Ika de Amre. According to this, Bas Mitzri Sheni Diksher Laguna Minale, how then would we find out that the daughter of a Mitzri man in the second generation who had a child, Diksher Laguna, how do we know this? If you want to say the Yalif Me'amoni Shanasa Bas Yisrael, we learn it out from the case where a man from Moab married a Bas Yisrael, which was the case of Rabbi Yochanan. Mala Amoni Shanasa Bas Yisrael Sheken Kevos Mutaros. Yeah, but in the case of Ammon and an Ammoni and an Ammonis, so then you can't learn from there, because in Ammoni the women are technically allowed. So you can't learn out the child of the Mitzri from here. And Mitzri Sheni Shanasa Mitzri Sheni Yochiach, says the Gemara. Maybe we can learn it out from a Mitzri man who marries a Mitzri's woman, that their daughter can marry a Kohen. Says the Gemara, not necessarily, because Mala Mitzri Sheni, Shanasa Mitzri Shniya, Shekain Ein Biaso Be'avera. You can't really learn anything from there, because those two people, a Mitzri and a Mitzri's in the second generation, are allowed to live together. So you can't learn that out from our case. Says the Gemara, first of the long lines on Ayin Zayin Amud Beis, Says the Gemara, Amoni Shanasa Bas Yisrael Yochiach. Really, we should go back to our previous case of Amoni Shanasa Bas Yisrael, which was the case of Rabbi Yochanan v'Chazar Hadin. And the Gemara says that this too is circular logic, where I ask a question, the perfect answer is over here. There's a flaw in the question, the perfect answer is over here, and we keep going around. And again, the halacha would be the same in the first version of Rabbi Yochanan of Rav Zakkai in front of Rabbi Yochanan as it would be over here, but just different ways to learn out the brisa. And still, there's a third understanding of this. Amar Rav Yosef, Hainu d'shamana le Rav Yehuda de Amar Amav me'amav v'lo yadana ma'ika Amar. I just figured out what's going on. I didn't understand what the drush of Amav me'amav was until I saw these two pshatim that we just saw. Ki Yasser of Shmuel bar Yehuda Amar Hachitana Kame. This was what was taught in front of him. Isha Amonis Kshera. The Brisa writes as follows: that a woman who is an Amonis, she is Kshera. Bina me Amoni. Her child from a man from Ammon is pasul, ubita me Ammoni kshera, and the daughter from a man from Ammon is kshera. This brisa requires some perush, but let's first finish the brisa. So what is this talking about? We're talking about a case be'amoni ve'amonis sheniskairu, where a male and female Ammoni and Ammonis, they were miskayer. Aval bita me Ammoni psula, but had it just been that the daughter is from a man from Ammon, then the daughter would be psula. Amar le pok tani l'rabra. He says, your Mishnah is ridiculous. Get out of the base medrash. Go take your brisa outside. Pok, go out. Tani, your brisa, l'bra, to the outside. Let's get rid of it. Why? My de amris isha amonis kshera. That which you said, that a woman who is an amonis is kshera, that makes perfect sense because of the drasha amoni v'lo amonis. And bename amoni pasul, when you say the son of a man from Ammon is pasul, that's perfect. We understand that too. Deha amonihi, who, because he's an Ammoni, the father and son are both Ammonim. Of course, he's going to be a pasul. But uvita me amoni kshera lemai. When we say that the daughter of a man from Ammon is kasher lemai, ilema lavo bekal hashta ima kshera himi baya. Of course, she's allowed to come into the kahal because her mother is an Ammonis, and therefore she's allowed to come into the kahal. Ella, it must be that when the brisa says that the bito me Ammoni is kshera, it must be ela lekehuna. And how do we understand the rest of the brisa? This is what the brisa said a couple of lines ago, that the parameters of the brisa where we said that the bita of the Ammoni was psula was when the mother and father are both Ammonim, an Ammoni and an Ammonis. My bita Ammoni, me Ammoni. What is the case then of the daughter of an Ammoni? Ilema Ammoni, shenasa Ammonis. If that case had been an Ammoni, shenasa Ammonis, hainu gioris mikano. That's the same case as having the regular case of gerus, of husband and wife gerus, no chidushin. And it must be Ammoni, shenasa bas Yisrael. And therefore, Amarle, poktani livra. It doesn't make sense what you're saying. The case of Ammoni, shenasa bas Yisrael, we know that already. That was taught by Rabbi Yochanan, therefore the brisa has to be wrong. Says the Gemara, what about Mitzri ve'adomi ein asurin? We had said in our Mishnah, a fascinating dialogue in the Mishnah that we learned yesterday. If you flip back to Ayin Vav Amud Beis, we had learned about this Mishnah on Ayin Vav Amud Beis that said in Ammoni and Moavi that the halacha is that they're Isurei Olam, but their wives are allowed. That's what we said. And then when it came to a Mitzri and Adomi, according to the Tanakama, we said only Shalosh Doros, but that it applied for Zacharim and Nekevos. Reb Shimon argued by a Mitzri and an Adomi and gave a Kal V'chomer. If it's going to be the case by Ammon and Moab that they have an Isra Olam, then their wives are allowed right away. Then by Mitzri and Adomi, where they only have 3 generations, then all the more so their wives should be okay, because it's much less of a severe prohibition on the men. So then the Gemara, the Mishnah had said on Ayin Vav Amud Beis in response to that, the Chachamim said back to Rav Shimon, I'll agree with you if in fact you have a Masorah. But if you don't have a Masorah, then we would like to reject your Kal V'chomer, because as the Gemara says, if you're making your own Kal V'chomer, then yesh tshuva. We have a way to reject your argument. So this is where the Gemara picks up 2/3 of the way down on Ayin Zayin Amud Beis. The Gemara says as follows, my tshuva, what is the response that they would have given to the Kal V'chomer Reb Shimon? Reb Shimon wanted to say, if by Ammon and Moab, which was an Isra Olamis, that the men are never allowed and the women are allowed right away, then by Mitzri and Adomi, where it's only a 3-generation prohibition on the men, all the more so the women should be allowed. So says the Gemara, my tshuva, what response would the Chachamim have had to Reb Shimon? Amar Rabbi Barachan Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Dika Lememar Arayos Yochicho Shelo Aser Behen Ela Ad Shalosh Toros Echad Zachar V'Echad Nekevos. Is that when we talk about like Isurei Arayos, we don't distinguish between men and women. So this is somewhat similar. There's 3 generations of prohibition that applies to both men and women. So unless you, Reb Shimon, have an excellent source for what you're saying, not your own Kal V'chomer, but a real Masorah, so then we're going to reject your Kal V'chomer with this question. Says the Gemara, no, Mala Arayos she came to Kares. You can't really bring Arayos into this conversation because Arayos deals with Kares. We are not dealing with Kares. We're dealing with regular Isurim. Says the Gemara, Mamzer Yochiach. A Mamzer can be brought as a raya here, where there is no kares, but the prohibitions apply to both men and to women. Says the Gemara, no, mamzer shekain eno roi lavo bakahal. But a mamzer is not like any of these other cases because they're not allowed to come into the kahal at all, and that's not true by a Mitzri and an Adome. They have only 3 generations. The olam arayos yochichos. It says the Gemara, well, there's another circular logic. It's the third one of the day, where we have circular logic that we have a statement, and then we asked a question, and the question was answered by another statement, and again circular logic. So it says the Gemara, this raya is not exactly like that one, but and that raya is not exactly like this one, but we do have a common denominator from which we can learn. So that's why the Gemara wants to reject the shita of Reb Shimon without him having had a halacha. Says the Gemara, you can't do that because it's not true, because we are in fact potentially dealing with a tzad kares of araya. So it's not such a simple circular logic like it was in other cases. How does the Tana Kama understand this case? How do they understand this at all? Says the Gemara, the reason why they didn't like Reb Shimon's argument was because they believed that if a Kohen Gadol, for example, were to be with someone who is only an Isser Aseh, that you can still have a status of Halal, Ucha Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov. That's the sheet of Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov, where you can have a Halal that's created by an Isser Aseh. And what does it mean when the Mishnah says lo ki? What is that talking about? So if you flip back to the Mishnah on Ayin Vav Amud Beis, you'll see toward the end of the Mishnah, on the last line of the Mishnah, that Amar Lahem, Shimon says back to them about their concern, lo. No, that is not correct what you're saying. Ki halacha ani omer, that really I do have a tradition. So what did he mean when he said no? Really, this is the halacha. So it says the Gemara, umay lo ki hachi kamar lu. This is what Reb Shimon was saying back to the Tana Kama. Didi lo svir le Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov. The whole svara of Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov that you can have an Isra Halal from an Isra Aseh is not something that I agree with. Not only that, but lididchu the sphere luchuk Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov halacha ani omer. Even according to you, who do hold of Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov's unique shita that with chayve aseh that you can have a halal, but still halacha ani omer. I'm giving you a masora. I'm not just giving you a kal v'chomer. And the Brisa supports this. Tanya Amar lahen Reb Shimon halacha ani omer v'od kram isayeni banim v'lobanos. The pasuk supports what I'm saying, that it's only the men and not the women, referring to the Mitzri and Adomi of our Mishnah, where he gave his kal v'chomer that the women don't apply to this. And Tan Rabbanon, another Brisa as well, that highlights a machlokas Tanaim, banim v'lobanos tiv Reb Shimon, Reb Shimon's l'shitaso, that the men are the prohibitions, but the women are allowed to marry in. And Amar Rabbi Yehuda, harehu Amar banim asher yuvaladu lam dor shlishi akasav tlam beleda, that it all depends on the birth, and that is the part of the machlokas that they have here. So that's how we see Reb Shimon's shita through and through, that he holds that the prohibition of Mitzri and Adomi only apply to men and doesn't apply to women. A little bit of an ancillary part of this sugya. It's really just picking on this last line. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Yilav dam Rabbi Yehuda akasav tlam beleda." Without Rabbi Yochanan having said his line that in regards to the Dor Shlishi, that it all depends on Leda, we wouldn't have had a seat for him in the Beis Medrash. He would have had nowhere to stand. It's a bit of a metaphor. It's a homily, just referencing the fact that one of his shitas was very complicated. What shita is that? Kevan de Amar Mar Kehal Ger Mikrikal, because Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that Kahal Gerim, that a ger is considered to be part of the Kal, then we have a nearly impossible scenario. Top of Ayin Chesam and Aleph, Mitzri Sheni b'mayi taher. How can a Mitzri Sheni ever be in a scenario where he can get to the third generation? He's not allowed to marry someone in the Kahal, and a ger is part of the Kal. Who's he supposed to marry? He's trapped. Dilma di of Arvanasi. Maybe the pasuk is only talking about if, in fact, the Mitzri Sheni did marry a Giores who really is Kahal, and really he's lo yaba bakal, it should be usher, but the child was to be kasher the kahuna. Says the Gemara, De'i lo kasiv kra. You don't get every what if scenario. If you violate this isser, then the child is going to be kasher the kahuna. We don't get all of that. That's not how the Torah works. Says the Gemara, yes, it is. Hari mamzer De'i b'kasav rachmana. The mamzer is a case of if the mamzer sleeps with someone, then the child is X, Y, or Z. Says the Gemara, De'i li isuraksiv. No, that's just the din. The din is that if a mamzer, that's what the din is that a mamzer can't sleep with someone who's part of the Kahal. And the Ilah lo kasa. But to say the din of the Mitzri Sheni is that, yeah, he's not allowed to sleep with someone who's a Giores. But if he did, then the child is mutter to a kohen. It's too much. The Torah doesn't speak out things like that. Hare, that's not true because machzir grushaso. What about the case where a man remarries his wife? In that case, the what if scenario is for a heter. V'kasve, nevertheless, it's written. It says Gemara, no, and with this we'll close. Hasim mishum ikari surahu de kasve. There, the only reason why the halacha of machzir grushaso was played out that way was because we had to go through the scenario of a man got divorced and the woman married another man and then they got divorced. We were just painting the picture. So that's different. We weren't going through all the what if scenarios that were forever possible. We were only going through what if scenarios that had to do with the basic psukim and chumash. And that's why this case was mentioned as it was. We'll stop right here on Ayin Ches Amud Aleph, 6 lines down at Tanu Rabbanan. Wishing you all a beautiful day.